straight out because he thinks and he knows Pharaoh's going to pursue them. And as soon as they face battle, they're going to freak out and they're going to want to go right now. And we see that later, don't we? Several times. They're like, oh, can't we go back to Egypt? So great. Forgetting what they were. So it was going great. They wander around, they get to the Dead Sea, and then, of course, they hit a dead end. And in Exodus chapter 14, we'll read just a little bit from there. Get to it. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and camp near Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal-Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around in land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds and said, what have we done? We've let the Israelites go and have lost their services. So he had his chariot made ready. He took his army with him. He took 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers all over them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, so he pursued the Israelites who were marching out. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen, troops, pursued the Israelites, overtook them as they camped by the sea. Blah, blah, blah. Pharaoh approached. The Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. So right there's the grumble, right? What were they actually asking for? Were they praying to God and saying, God, thank you for letting us be slaves. Life is good here in Egypt. We're very happy. We appreciate the opportunity to make bricks without straw handed to us. Thank you for that blessing of opportunity. No, they were bitter. They were crying out. They were wanting to be released. Now they're released, and they're saying, and just as God had said, they were trapped, weren't they? And they had nowhere to go, and their response was, let's just go back to Egypt. That would have been so much better than what you've done to us. Moses, though, knows what's about to happen. He says, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring to you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the heart of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and his army, through his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other, so that neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind, turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued, and all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, blah, 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 followed them. During the last night of the night, the Lord looked down, last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots, so they had difficulty driving. And they said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch your hand over the sea so the waters may flow back over the Egyptians. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. So that was a long reading, but I wanted to read that to establish where the Israelites were. They had just witnessed what might have been one of the most amazing miracles that you could see. I can't even imagine, and I've seen like the old movie with Charlton Heston and all those. I can't imagine what that must have looked like with that sea to open, and for them to feel trapped, and to feel and to know we're dying, and to see that angel which had been in front of them the whole time, and that pillar to move and stand between them and the Egyptian army. To witness all of that and to come through all of that and to turn around and see that sea collapse and just wipe out the army must have been astounding. And for them, at the moment at least, it was, wasn't it? Because what was their response?
Fear.
They feared the Lord, they trusted God, it says, and they trusted his servant Moses. So we're in a good spot. They have come through all of this. They have finally become free. By the way, we talked last time, there's a lot of speculation about exactly what time in history, who was Pharaoh when Moses and all of them were there, when exactly they left, where exactly they went. I don't know if you ever go to this website, bible.ca. Somebody that I know knows the person who runs it. His name is Steve Rudd. And he has this map on there. And most of the time we think they crossed right up here. And a lot of people will say there was like a marshy area or something that's no longer there today, and it was more like a canal, maybe. Based on his theory, and this is of no consequence to me, but his theory is that they wandered way down here. Laser's not working. Yeah, there it is. Way down here and actually crossed way down here on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula, and then Mount Sinai is actually right here. This is what most people would consider the traditional side of Mount Sinai, which is Mount Musa. So anyway, nevertheless, they crossed the sea with God's help. He held the waters back, he pushed them back, and then he saved them. And so now they're free. He laid a trap, the Egyptians are wiped out, and now this nation, they're truly free. For the first time in a long time, they're a nation of people outside of the borders of Egypt, and there's no more threat of Egyptians. It's gone. And so now they're ready to go on to the promised land, right? But we see the troubles just beginning. So one of the first ones I want to talk about is Exodus chapter 16. So they've been wandering for just a little while, but we get over to Exodus chapter 16. And starting in verse 1, it says, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. So they've been out for 2.5 months, or no, 1.5 months. They have been out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve the entire assembly to death. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for the day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in. And that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. And so we're told that God is going to send down bread from heaven. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then he tells them, go out every day and gather how much they need for their family. And on the 6th day, gather a double portion, right? Because on the 7th day, they're going to rest. And they're not going to be gathering. Not that there would be anything for them to gather anyway. Moses also said, you will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. And so, verse 9, then Moses and Aaron Moses told Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. When Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked towards the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. The Lord said, I have heard the grumbling. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am God. That evening quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. The Israelites did. Some gathered much, some little. But it ended up being what they needed. Moses said, no one is to keep any of it until morning. But some paid no attention. They kept it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. And so we read on that every morning they would go out and there was this stuff. Manna. And I had always thought, when I was a kid, it was like bread, like rolls from heaven. But what was it actually like? It's described in some detail. We're told that it was like flakes here. We're told later that it was like coriander seeds. If you've seen those, they're kind of small. So I don't know, it was almost like grain in a way that they would scoop up and they would fill this bucket with. And that was what they would eat, but we're told it was tasty, and it's literal bread from heaven. And at night, they had quail. And I don't know if you've ever had quail, but quail's pretty tasty. I love quail. And we used to hunt quail when I was a kid all the time, and it's very tasty. And so they were grumbling, and back to their original complaint, they said, oh, if only we had just been in Egypt. We had pots full of meat. Everything was great. And here they are, now grumbling. And so that's the complaint. God's response was, he said, I heard them. I've heard the grumbling. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you this bread from heaven every morning, and you collect as much as you want to eat. But he says, don't collect more than that, because if you do, it's just going to go bad. And I'm going to send you quail. And I have no idea how the quail showed up. And if they just caught a live quail, or if there was quail laying there, but there was quail that would show up every night. And so keep in mind what they've seen. They've seen we won't even go back to the plagues. They've seen the sea split apart. They've walked through a sea on dry ground. They've seen that sea collapse. They've seen the angel of God and the pillar of God move and stand between them and the army. They've seen all of this. And we're told when they saw that, they were fearful of God. And they trusted God, and they trusted Moses. But 6 weeks in, they're getting to be pretty grumpy. So next we see they grumble for water. The same thing. Exodus chapter 17. They grumbled for food, and they got the food. So then it says in 17 verse 1, the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. Moses said, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water, and they grumbled against him. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. And the Lord answered, go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out for the people to drink. So Moses did that, and people had water to drink. And so, grumbling for water. That was the complaint. We're thirsty. Once again, why did you bring us out of Egypt? What was the initial request? Way back in chapter 2. They're slaves.
Get us out of this.
Please, God, get us out of this. So he does. And again, he does it through tremendous, unbelievable miracles that he does it. He saves them. 6 weeks later, they seem to have lost all faith and confidence in God. Well, why did you bring us here? Why did you deliver us? Well, who delivered them, first of all? Did Moses deliver them? They're venting at Moses over and over. And every time Moses is correctly saying, are you mad at me, or are you mad at the guy who saved you? Are you mad at God? Because you're not, what can I do? He is leading them, but God is the one who saved them. And so they've complained about food, which God said, I heard you, here's your food. Now they're complaining about water. God says, I heard you, here's water. So here's the question, though. Was the grumbling for food and water reasonable?
No.
To have that.
I mean, you have to have food and water to live, don't you?
Right. That is asking for and is grumbling about.
Yeah. There's a big difference, isn't there?
Yeah.
You know, Jesus says in the model prayer, give us today our daily bread. Ask God for your daily bread. Trust in God. But they're not asking. They're complaining, and they're making horrible assumptions, and they're making accusations. And they're also saying being slaves was so much better. They've completely forgotten all that they were suffering through and all that God did for them. And so there's nothing about their handling of needing food and needing water that I would say was handled correctly. There is a way to get those things you need, but doing it correctly is the key. Yes?
I feel like it was almost like they thought God was like their gods, the gods of the Egyptians and the gods of earth, but petty. They would play with people, torment people for their own pleasure. Like they felt like God was just leading them out, giving them food, and then making them suffer just for his own pleasure, or something like what the other gods in the land around them would do, because they all had human characteristics. They were petty, they were jealous, they engaged in all these different things. They never seemed to quite get it that God cared for their nation, that God was not going to let them starve. God was going to lead them to where he promised to lead them to. God was going to take care of them. They never seemed to get that. And so even after seeing all these miracles, one right after another, these great miracles, I mean, quail every night, all that quail to feed 500,000 people, that's not normal. But they just didn't get it.
Yeah. And that's a good point you raised, and we're looking at this from our perspective. Western civilization, 3,000, 3,500 years later, they are accustomed to the gods of Egypt. And the gods of Egypt were the same as the gods of all of the people of the ancient East. They were, as you said, they were spiteful. They were intent on being served, and there was punishment if they weren't. So it makes sense that they would view this situation through that kind of perspective. However, to your point, their God has done a lot of mighty, amazing things. He's told them, I've heard your cries, I'm going to save you, and he's done exactly what he said. Yes?
The other thing to remember is that the belief in the ancient world was that the gods were territorial. The Egyptians had their Egyptian gods. And now, the God who is showing himself strong for Israel in Egypt, they're not in Egypt anymore.
Right.
And so in their mind, the question is probably also, is Yahweh a territorial God? Is he still with us? Can he still bless us, even though we're not where we were when we saw his power?
Yeah, that's a good point too, that they have left the borders of the only place they've known. And I guess the only thing I would say in response to that is, once they left Egypt and got through the sea, they still saw that pillar. They still saw he was there. Maybe his power was diminished, I don't know. And he was still feeding them every day. But they're grumbling, and I think human nature isn't defined necessarily by the age we live in. Human nature is human nature. And I think people back then do just like we might do today. They forget how good we have it, and they forget how bad things were before. Paul talks about, you leave this life of sin and you come into this new life in Christ. Why would you ever go back, to that, to being a slave to sin? A parallel to this, you're longing to go back to something you had, forgetting how bad it really was. Even if it was fun, in the sin, ultimately everybody understands how bad it was. Yes, sorry.
I felt they kept exaggerating. Every time they said, well, you're just going to let us die. You're
Right.
just going to let us die. every time they went to that final thing, it wasn't that we need water and we're gonna ask you for water and you're gonna take care of us like you led us through the dry land, nonsense. We're gonna just die. We're gonna die. We're gonna die with no food, no water, no protection.
Yeah.
We're just gonna die.
They jumped to the worst possible conclusion.
Yes.
But none of us are guilty of doing that today.
Oh, I know.
So, right? We'll talk more about that. Exodus chapter 18, I wanted to just quickly go through this. There was actually no grumbling in here. I'm making an assumption, just knowing how the people are. But you remember what the situation was in Exodus chapter 18? This whole chapter is talking about Moses meeting his father-in-law. So he's back in the land of Midian. Jethro, his father-in-law, they come up and Moses is just telling them everything that's happened. And Jethro's like, that's amazing. Praise God for doing that. Tell me how your day's going, Moses. And what's Moses' day-to-day look like?
Low grumbling.
He's dealing with a lot of people and a lot of problems, isn't he? He's like, well, pretty much I sit and hold court all day, every day. I have to sit there and I have complaints coming to me. This person has a problem with this person. This thing happened. This person wants some justice, and he's having to deal with all these issues all day, every day. And remember that Jethro's advice is, why are you doing that? Why are you taking on so much responsibility? Go find yourself a bunch of guys who are really trustworthy, who can't be bribed, who are upright people. Let them judge for you. Let them be the judges. Let everybody know these guys are going to be my judges. And if it gets too hard for them to figure out, they'll bring it to you, and then you'll just deal with the exceptions, right? Great advice, by the way, for people who like to be the ones to do it all, because if you want it done right, do it yourself kind of thing. And he's like, no, don't do that. So great advice. But I imagine that what Moses was hearing was a lot of bickering. And have you ever watched the People's Court or any of the judge shows today? It's just the most ridiculous squabbles and just the most petty little things that people fight over. And I'm sure that he was hearing a lot of that all day, every day. And so we've talked about that. We talked about that. How would the law, when God delivers the law in all of its detail, how is that going to make this kind of situation at least a little bit better, theoretically? What was Moses operating under? What legal framework was he operating under? Did he have one? He might have been pulling in some Egyptian law, he might have been pulling in some common sense, but he didn't really have something that we know of to fall back on and say, here's the standard. And so one of the nice things about the law, and we're not going to get into it, but God goes into great detail in much of the law about personal matters, doesn't he? But what if your ox gores somebody, pokes a hole in them? Well, here's what you do about that. What if you accidentally hurt somebody, and break their arm or poke out their eyeball? Well, here's what you do about that. So a lot of this kind of stuff that people might have fought over, God in his wisdom has delivered this law that clearly lays out, here's how you handle situations where people have been wronged and justice needs to be put into effect. And so we won't talk about that, but just know that for a lot of Moses' life in this time, he's just dealing with not only the grumblings of the entire nation, oh, we're all going to die, let's go back to Egypt, but he's dealing with personal squabbles and personal issues between people as well. And then we get to grumbling for idols. Exodus chapter 32, a way jump ahead, but I want to look at a few of these key passages before we get to the story in Exodus chapter 32. So first of all, in Exodus chapter 19, it's like this. It would be better just to have my Bible, much faster. Starting in verse 3. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. And then we'll jump over to chapter 20. Starting in verse 1, and God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And let me, by the way, step back before we do that. God has been speaking to Moses previously on the mountain. And then he tells Moses, I'm going to talk to everybody. The time has come for me to talk to everybody. And so Moses goes down and tells them, God is going to talk to us all. Get yourselves ready. Make sure you don't go and touch this mountain or you'll die. All that business. And he says, God is going to talk to everybody. And now, God is talking to everybody. And what we just read, God has said, I want them to be my holy people, but they got to follow what I say. And they all agree. We're going to do that. We'll do whatever the Lord says. So now God is talking. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And so we've established that the people have said, yes, we're going to follow God. We're going to do what he teaches us. We want to be his people and be blessed by him. They hear this. Now, God talks, and how is God's presentation? How does he appear to them? Is he sitting there with his legs crossed? No, he's speaking, we're told, as thunder. It's loud. It's terrifying. So terrifying that the people finally just say, enough. Moses, go talk to him. We'll die if he keeps talking. We can't hear him. You go talk to him and just tell us what he says, which Moses does. But they've agreed to all of this. And, of course, the first two commands that God gives are have no other gods and make no images. So then we go all the way down to chapter 32. There's a lot of the law being given in between that. But chapter 32, Moses has been up in the mountain for a long time talking with God. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron, and they said, come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. Aaron answered them, take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me. So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol, cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Then the Lord said to Moses, go down, because your people whom you brought out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. And so the rest of the story, is really bad. But they go to Aaron, because what's happened to Moses? He's up there talking to God. We don't want to talk to God. And so he's like, okay, you need something to worship instead? The calf. Now, what was Aaron's explanation when Moses came back down and it's like, what on earth is going on here? What did Aaron say? Oh, yeah, I just melted all the gold and poof, it came out. But it tells us he cast it and then he fashioned it. He took tools to it and he made it and then he built an altar in front of it. And there's a lot of people who I've heard say, well, and I probably would have done the same thing. I don't want these people to kill me. I would be terrified of these people. But Aaron does exactly what they asked for, and then they immediately take all of the glory of God, the true God, and they say, this is your gods, plural, who delivered you out of Egypt. They transferred everything from Jehovah God to this golden calf. And they worshipped it, and they engaged in revelry, and it was a huge mess. And of course, Moses came down, and he was just like, Levites cleaned this mess up, and it was pretty brutal. He told them, all of you Levites go through, kill everybody who's doing this nonsense, whether it's your family member or your friend or whoever, put them to death. And I forget the number, but like 30,000 people. Somebody can correct me on that. A lot of people died. But they knew Moses was up there. The evidence that God's presence was with them was still with them. It had never gone away. But they just lost patience, and they assumed, man, we don't know what's happened to him. He's up there. We want something to do. Talked about that. God's response was rightfully upset, told Moses, go down and deal with this mess. These people who I brought out now are saying this cow has brought them out, and not good. So here's a question, not to sound as bad as it sounds, but can we be guilty of the same thing? Not meaning that we would create a golden calf and worship it, but can we be guilty of the same idea of taking glory away from God and attributing it to something else?
I think too often we want to attribute it to ourselves and what we have done, having ourselves on the back with how great we are and how smart we are, etc.
Yeah. We often, when times are lean, what do?
Right.
We pray, just like the Israelites. We pray, we petition God, and then times are good, and it's all about, I've done good. Look at me, I'm doing good for myself. My barns are full. I'm going to tear them down and build bigger barns, and store up even more for myself. And so, a bit of a stretch. Not trying to say we're like them in this, but the fact is that we can sometimes take the glory that rightfully belongs to God and the blessings that come from Him, and we can attribute them to ourselves primarily. And that's what these people were doing, and ultimately they were just serving themselves. They wanted to worship the way they wanted to worship. They wanted something that was old and familiar to them, and nothing more familiar than the image of a cow for them to worship. That's something they had seen throughout their years in Egypt. A couple more that I want to get to very quickly. And you know what? I'm not, because I've got too many slides left. So it'll take 5 minutes Wednesday night. We'll wrap this up. And then we're going to talk about what is the solution. We've talked a lot about the problems. What are the solutions to the grumbling and the complaining?
You want to speculate on Aaron?
I'm sorry?
You want to speculate on Aaron?
Do I want to speculate on Aaron? I felt like I did speculate.
No, was he killed? Was he guilty? Was he killed with the other 3,000?
He was not killed, no.
Why was he spared?
Well, that's what he's asking.
Oh, you want me to speculate on why he
Why
got
he
to
was
live?
spared? I mean, he was the guy that did it, wasn't
That's
he?
correct. Yeah, no, I don't want to speculate on. Do you have an answer?
I've always wondered about that.
Yeah. I mean, Aaron obviously knew what he was doing was wrong. And I am sure that he was highly repentant the moment he got busted. The rest of the folks weren't. They were engaged in revelry and being slaughtered in the act. That's all I can possibly say about it. But interesting thought. Yes?
People were really lucky that Moses felt compassion for them, because God offered, I believe, to wipe out the people and start fresh with Moses.
That's correct.
And he interceded for them and convinced God not to do that. But
We call them stiff-necked. I looked
Yeah.
at 3 different translations to see if there was a different word, but
Yeah.
stiff-necked was
Yeah.
chosen. Multiple.
Yeah.
It's just,
My version says God. You say gods.
About the calf?
Uh-huh. My version never said gods.
You're probably reading the wrong version then, I don't know.
I know. I think I am, I think.
I'm reading the English, whatever.
Okay.
Your English version.
The newest one. So, all right, well, I appreciate it. We've got just about 5 minutes to get through this, and then we're going to move on to a few more characters as we wrap up the next few weeks. Thank you so much.